I go through this process weekly in which I go into these different disciplines in design. And whenever it's Thursday morning, I have an odd sort of feeling. It's a very different energy that I seem to connect to whenever I do this thing, and my tendency is to move outside of my own program for this every once in a while, and this is one of those occasions. Talk about the mystical for a moment. It's like these images. In my experience, it's always been misleading for people that I call the thing that I had, the entity that I had a relationship with, the voice. And so there is this tendency to see, or to think of that quite literally, obviously. That's, for most people, that is the way I got my information. I actually only called it the voice because, aside from the fact that there is no name that I can grasp for the design crystal bundle. There is no name I can grasp for it other than a generic description of a design crystal bundle. That's what I met first. I mean, that was my first experience in my encounter, was to hear this extraordinarily different frequency interpreted in me as a voice talking to me out of nowhere. One of those quintessentially mad moments. And it's so interesting to see the relationship between what is the extraordinary and what is madness. And the mystical is something that is not for the weak. That's so clear to me. I've seen so many people burnt on the shaman path who had the desire but not the genetics to survive such an ordeal. And it's one of the things that's so obvious to me about what happened to me. I mean, to have a unconscious mind, a totally unconscious mind, and have it defined as I do through the 4323 is a very odd thing to live with, because you have absolutely no access to it. You really don't know what's going on inside of it. I was always intelligent relative to the environment around me, but I was never as intelligent as after my encounter with the voice. And I seem to have grasped things at a level that I consciously was unaware that I had grasped them. I think that was probably the most startling thing for me to recognize, was that my unconscious, my vehicle, my brain in that sense, was impacted directly in that experience. My passenger is just, sits back and looks at all of that and says, whoa, this is strange. It was clear to me that the knowledge that I was given, that it wasn't given to my personality. I mean, it was given to my design. After all, I was, my encounter was with the design crystal bundle. I don't think that it was interested in my personality, as a matter of fact. And the experience for me, see, when I talk about the beginning, when I talk about this cosmology, and I talk about the crystals of consciousness, I have absolutely no difficulty in fully embracing that, because it's me. And what I mean is that it is clear to me that the crystals of consciousness that I have were there. And there is a part of me And knowing is not a word that I can use because it is not something that belongs to my passenger. But there is I guess it's more acoustic than anything else. There is a deep connection to the frequency of it. See, when you think about yourself, and if you think about yourself in its most mystical dimension, I'm talking about your birth. All of this cosmology that we are doing here together, this is not an abstract. This is not something that's out there or happened back then. This is like looking at our baby pictures. This is going back into the source. And in going back to the source, we go back down the fractal lines. And these fractal lines, they mean everything. Everything. When you talk about the potential of any human being to come into an incarnation with the possibility of being awake, that has to do with where they are on the fractal lines from the center. Has nothing to do with, the various this and that's of their nature, their design, their incarnation cross, their boo 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 bang bang. See these crystals. It's this shattering that is so extraordinary. It's the shattering. You have them, I have them. This life on this planet is nothing but seeded with crystals of consciousness. And they all came from the original source. And when I was given this cosmology, it was the first, it was the first evening of my encounter. It's clear to me that somehow, within the very crystal nature of the structure or the infrastructure of whatever these crystals may be, that there is a way to access not so much memory as the string. And today we're going to talk about the string. And the string is a very poetic way for me to talk about... Hold on a second, folks, sorry. I just had a 6-year-old girl trying to find out where my 6-year-old son was, which is very cute, but nonetheless, I'm sorry for the disturbance. I guess she just wanted to tune in. The frequency. It's clear to me that through these very crystals, we all have a way of connecting back to our source. And of course, this whole story that we're looking at, this cosmology, this is what it's all about. It's not about an abstract, and this is something that you have to take inside at a spiritual level, that you're really looking at your aspect at its beginning, that you're a part of this, that in the oddest sense of the word, you're somewhere in that picture. I mean, the personality crystal that you have, it was there. I mean, it was there from the beginning. I remember when I first went on tour, and in my first tour to America, and I had driven into Sedona, and I did an introductory lecture. And after the lecture, a woman came up to me and she said to me, "You're an old soul." And I find that kind of thing rather offensive, and I said to her, "Well, so are you." I said, "And so's everybody else." We all started at the beginning together. All of us. All of us. That's what makes... If you strip away the Maya, if you strip away the illusions, if you strip away the dilemma and suffering of the not-self, if you get rid of all of that, you begin to see that, we as a consciousness potential have been in existence literally forever. And there is a continuity and a line the string, the neutrino line. That was always there. Always there. And along that line, everything happens. And you see, regardless of how we can look at the Maya today, we are still all part of that movement that began back in this image. And what you're looking here in this plate is that, you're looking at the illustration of what happened after the crystals collided. In other words, this is, and in understanding it from the sense of the physics, that is, that basically what you have is that out of a very, very tiny compressed point, and when I say compressed, I'm talking about compression in the way in which we understand, for example, a black hole. Basically, a black hole is not black and it's not a hole. It's simply an object that is so dense, it has so much mass compressed into an abnormally small size that its gravitational force is such that not only does it pull everything to it, but it even strips light and turns light into matter. In other words, it strips the light from around it, and pulls it into its form, which is why we don't see them, but we can see the effect of them because there is this kind of cosmic flushing of a toilet in which you see this outside rim of energy being pulled into a nothingness. Now, the thing is clear that if you have an object that's going to bang into one of these black holes, that the potential is in an absolutely extraordinary release of energy. It is assumed that new star birth results in such events. And when we look at the beginning, when we're looking at the Big Bang, what we are looking at is an extraordinary compression that suddenly explodes. So the first thing to recognize about that is two things. One is that the explosion is going to create enormous heat. I mean, the kind of heat that is truly beyond anybody other than, people who are really absorbed in that kind of information can grasp. I mean, we're not talking about the heat of the sun. We're talking about the heat of billions and billions of them. We're talking about an intensity of heat that is so extraordinary, it's unbelievable. And of course, the moment that you have this extraordinary heat, you have something else. You have light. Remember that the moment that we leave singularity, the moment that we leave that milli whatever just before the crystals collide, the moment we leave there, we enter into the realm of relativity, and the realm of relativity is a realm of light. So what we have in this moment of the Big Bang is that we have the shattering of the crystals. We have this release of enormous heat, and everything is moving outward at an extraordinary speed. Now there's a line of geometry that stretches so far back it cannot even be dreamt. And it is this line of geometry that is the only thing that connects us to what is beyond us. There's an extraordinary tradition amongst the Navajo Indians in the American Southwest. And the Navajo were quite an extraordinary people. They had a very interesting cosmology. They are the only tribe on the planet that claims to know where the umbilical cord is in the sky that goes to the Great Mother. And there is this line of geometry. There is a neutrino line that goes beyond the singularity, goes back into, or beyond, if you will, connecting us to a continuity that is enormous. I mean, there's no way of understanding that. But you see, the very totality itself, if you look at that drawing, basically what you're looking at is that is the universe, the biverse. It hasn't inflated yet. It's part of this very, very rapid, high heat inflation that's taking place from the moment of the explosion. And all of it is operating in a pre-existent geometry. It is not random. The shattered binary held by the monopole. So the prime magnetic monopole is not disembedded. The shattered binary held by the monopole rides the incredible energy wave holding to this line. It's movement in space. See, I've had these discussions at many, many levels in teaching the knowledge. It's like when I taught death and dying. One of the most fascinating things that was revealed to me. To be able to understand the Bardo states, to truly be able to grasp how the out works as much as how the in works in that sense. This line is an extraordinary thing. There is this very, very specific geometry that's there. And it is this exact moving down this line of geometry that becomes what life is. In Death and Dying, I talked about how life is not a time. It's not a time. It's a place. It's got a perfect GPS. It's a place. And we get there. And it's not a place that exists until you get there. Let's say that there is a street that you walk down where you're eventually going to die. There's a place on that street, exactly a place, where you will meet the end of your string, the end of your line. And you can go by that place many times, but it's not yet the place because we're moving in space. There's this enormous alignment in the way in which the geometries operate. And the moment you get to that place, that's it. Everything is moving. It is the most mystical thing to understand about Maya. Everything is moving. Your body is nothing but an incredible moving frequency of electrons, protons, and neutrons, and nothing else, bubbling and vibrating. And it's all frequency. And we're hurtling in space. We are not designed to appreciate that. Think about what it would be like if we were conscious of our earth spinning under our feet. We would not be very happy with that. And think about what it would be like if we pondered how fast our solar system is going around the outer arm of our galaxy at over 240,000 kilometers an hour. What an extraordinary thing. We're flying in space. And everything is flying away from everything else. And it's all can go back. You can measure it down the line, all the way back to the source. I'm always amused by people who send me star pictures. I get a lot of star pictures. Star clusters and Hubble pictures. I enjoy those things. They're great. But you see, when I look at the night sky, I'm very aware of something. Always aware of something. I'm looking at the past. We will get in this semester to a magical plate where I will tell you about a star that's not there, but we still see it. When you look in the night sky, you're looking at the past. When you see one of these extraordinary Hubble photographs of some magnificent nebula, 200 million light years away, you're looking back 200 million years. And that past, it's all up here now. It's all movement. And so we can look back now with these photographic, spectrographic, all the scientific tools. We now look at our history going all the way back. Same principle. I want you to understand your mystical history. This is everyone's mystical history. And you see, we all have a part in the movie. Everybody does. We were all there at the beginning. So we have this shattering, and we have the monopole holding it all together, and we have this incredible movement in that sense through space. Okay. Compared to everything else, racing out from the impact, the bundle, mostly ban aspects, that is something that will be, and it's an important thing to understand. Remember that it is the ban aspects that ultimately are going to take the role of personality crystal. And it's something else to understand, that all of the instruments of manipulating our consciousness field, and these instruments will include stars, moons, that these are objects that are endowed with ban crystals. Now, in the sense of objects, it's hard to call them personality crystals, and I would prefer that we refer to them as ban aspects. But the fact is that they give these objects their nature. We call Jupiter Jupiter because we experience it uniquely through its crystal. So here we have this moving outward, the bundle mostly ban aspects, the prime magnetic monopole and the prime design crystal and its core aspects, and it moves slowly. Now, slowly is a relative term. This is relative to the light and the string. Now, light and string have a funny relationship to each other. See, Einstein, in the theory of relativity, determined that the speed of light is 186,000 miles a second. And that speed for light, which is a constant, because if you don't have a constant as the speed of light, then the whole theory of relativity collapses. So all kinds of experiments have been done to verify that this is a constant, 186,000 miles a second. Now remember that in the beginning we had quarks and leptons. And if you go back to that first little physics lesson, the leptons were made up of electrons and neutrinos. So you have this light, the electron at the speed of light, moving outward, in a sense illuminating the darkness, which is in and of itself a beautiful image. But not keeping pace with it, but just behind. And always losing ground in that sense is the neutrino string. And the neutrino string is really the thing. That sounds cute, but it is. Right now, physicists understand for the first time that what they call the universe, the biverse, is built on a neutrino grid. This is the most abundant particle in the universe. 40% of all matter is neutrino. So we have this, what I refer to as the neutrino ocean. We have this vast, vast neutrino matrix. And everything about the neutrino, it is in essence the thing that makes it all possible. Because it is the neutrino that lays out not only the geometry, but becomes the interactive, communicative hardware, software for the consciousness field. And one of the things that we're going to see is that neutrinos are something that are only made in stars. Now there is one very, very unusual exception. And it's one of those things that is always a ready answer for me when people scoff at the fact that I say that there are no aliens and there are no other, life forms that are out there in the universe. And it's really clear to begin with that not only are we alone, but it's a good thing, because the fact of the matter is that this is our body. I mean, it's a good thing that we're alone. The only place in the entire universe where neutrinos are produced, and it's not a star, is here. Right here on Earth. From the moment in Alamogordo, New Mexico, when they fired off the first atomic bomb, we began to release neutrinos into the totality. It says something extraordinary about what's going on here. Because you see, from the moment that we began producing neutrinos, not only were we filtering agents of the neutrino field moving through us, being transformed and going outwards, but we were also creating a whole new information feed simply by releasing this neutrino information ourselves, uniquely from us as a source. So that there is a frequency to the earth that began in the 1940s that is unlike a frequency that it has ever had. So the neutrino string, as it moves out, and I want you to understand that it's not this bundle that you're looking at in this image that is creating the neutrino string. You know, the prime magnetic monopole, it has not fully shattered. And the fact of the matter is that until it does so, it is not going to have its anti-neutrino core transformed. In other words, the neutrino ocean existed from the moment that this whole process began. In other words, there was already a source producing neutrinos. We'll get there. The energy waves stripped away the vast majority of the shattered two aspects. And as the movement reduced the heat, the energy began to freeze into form around the two cellular aspects. This first basic elements came into existence. The building of the cosmic body had begun. So let's think about this. The thing that to understand is that at this point, and it's no point talking about it as liquid, but given the nature of the heat, I want you to recognize how there could be no concretization of form. There was this enormous fluidity and movement in the heat. But of course, this explosion could not maintain that heat. As a matter of fact, 40, 50 million years later, the universe would already begin to take on its very cold temperature. As a matter of fact, our studies going back over billions of years indicate that there was a rapid, if you will, we're talking about, for us, enormous periods of time, but in the nature of a 15 billion year old cosmos, it was relatively fast that things cooled down, and it's this very cooling, this freezing, that froze this expanding, conglomeration into forms. And this is the beginning of the two aspects taking on their material form evolutionary potential. In other words, all of the possibilities of the creation of form principle, this is what was beginning to concretize. Now, obviously, at this point, we're still not talking about anything that is really familiar to us. You have, for example, from the point of view of physics, at this particular time, you would have what they call proto-galaxies. In other words, areas of split off energy material, concretizing in the coolness and concretizing around obviously heated up components, and the swirling that begins, and ultimately out of that the growth of the galaxies. So this stage, this process is very important, this movement through space. And one of the things you're going to see about the cosmology is that in fact we've always been moving. So for example, when we get to the end of this present round, which is going to last another 1,300 years or so, when we get to the end of this round, and there is again the termination of this aspect of the evolution, the crystals will bundle again and they will move in space again. One of the many things that we'll talk about in the course of going through this course. All right, here we have the two yin-yin, if you will, and its antineutrino core. With string and clay, the builder's way. And of course, this is the whole secret of life. The string is the neutrino information, the neutrino consciousness ocean, and the clay is a metaphor in the same way that God made Adam out of clay. That it is a metaphor that the magic that we call life is something that is rooted in the inanimate. And for me, this is one of the things that, is so extraordinary. It's one of the most extraordinary thing about crystals. I can remember in grade school, we had a science teacher, and we grew crystals, and I found that to be a magical. The inanimate growing, and so it is one of those things to see that herein lies life. This is the whole core of what it is to be in form, and ultimately what we live out as our design crystals that run our vehicles and are the key to our strategy in life and all of that. So this is the home of the form crystal itself. That particular it looks like a quotation. This is what I heard as I sort of saw these things. Again, my experience was multi-dimensional, if I can use that kind of terminology. Some things were seen. The word rave is not something that I ever heard. I only saw it written out in that sense. Same thing with the G Center. So there were many aspects of it, but this is what rolled by while I was experiencing this. And IO is something that we will get to, because IO is an interesting aspect in the way in which the global orchestration directories work. You notice that? That's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful terminology. It's good enough to make you laugh. The global orchestration directories, the gods, global orchestration directories. We will get to them and how that actually operates. But here we're dealing with the two. And the two is the builder of the body of the child. And in that sense, what you're looking at is, if you could take all of our design crystals and you could, in a sense, put them back together again. Like Humpty Dumpty, after the shattering of the crystal, you put them all back together again the way they're supposed to be put back together again. What you would have is the design crystal of the totality. See, that's what we are. We're an aspect of the form principle of the whole. That's us. The program formula was compressed and dormant. And, the compression is that all of that is being held together by, this non-shattered aspect. And at the core, before the start, then on impact, the race began. And what I just described to you, first the light piercing the darkness, then the string close behind laying out the lines. Now think about the string close behind. Light, as I mentioned, travels at 186,000 miles a second. Neutrinos, because they have mass, but because the mass in and of itself for a single neutrino is, it's incredibly tiny, that they travel slightly less quickly. In other words, I don't have speed measurements, but they travel at about 98 to 99% of the speed of light. So the light is always moving out ahead. The consciousness is always building its format, building the matrix that ultimately is going to be the nature of the totality itself. The most interesting thing is that this moving outwards is an expansion in which everything is moving away from everything else. So as the light, in that sense, keeps spreading, then the vastness of the potential of the cosmos that we live in, this is something that could be naturally laid out. In other words, simply the neutrinos, following the fractal lines of the light movement and laying out all of these tracks and laying out specific tracks for what are going to end up being, the other aspects of the body, of the totality. When I think about humanity, one of my metaphors is cellular. In other words, all human beings are cells in a larger body, let's say. Actually, all human beings are cells in a gland, because that's more correct in that sense. And it is obvious to me that there are different responsibilities in any cellular construct. The one thing you must grasp from the very beginning when you're looking at this cosmology, and it is evidenced in every cosmology that's ever been presented to humanity, is that this is fundamentally hierarchical. It just is. Fractal lines are fundamentally hierarchical. And it's one of the things that concerns me in sharing this knowledge, is that there is an aspect to this that feeds vanity and a sense of misplaced importance, when the most important goal we can have is to find humility in all of this. Remember, the string was always there from before the start. And again, this is, for me, this is the only way that I can see past the ring, past naught, is an understanding that the continuity was always there. See, Einstein, in trying to understand the nature of the universe, created what we call time. I mean, basically the formula, states that time has a beginning and time has an end. Because there is no time in the physics of relativity before the beginning. There is no beginning before the start. There is no time. The time only emerges when light emerges. And of course, in Einstein's equation, you end up with time-space as the dimension itself. But it's obvious. It's just obvious. And particularly from the point that, for me, it was just, everything inside of me grasps that our understanding of time is simply the limitation of our Einstein relativity. That there is a continuity, that there is a line, that there is a geometry that goes far beyond the before of the emergence of this biverse. And that line is a line of string, which means that there is a programming agency of the consciousness beyond the ring past naught that touches us. That touches us. Always dangerous to say that, because it opens up a doorway for the finger of God to stick itself through the roof. Nonetheless, I don't see it in that way. What I do recognize is that the consciousness that is developing here is a consciousness that has been informed at its primary level by a much more ancient consciousness, a consciousness from before the start. So the string was always there, and it was there before the start. And the shattering of the two is the forking of the paths. This is the biverse, variations on an image through an infinitely shattered mirror. And this is the magic, this infinitely shattered mirror. You go back to the basic principle of the crystal. The crystal is endowed with a certain, nature, structure. And then you have this extraordinary shattering. And every single one of those aspects are required in that sense. And all of them have an intrinsic relationship to each other, because they are all aspects of a whole. That crystal as a whole. I mean, it's not like any of the shattered crystals were lost in that sense. In the image, you're looking at the band. and the magnetic monopole, the prime magnetic monopole, embedded in the prime design crystal. And there's this little quote underneath, and it's one of my favorites. It's from Robert Browning, famous 19th century poet. And he had this mystical dream. And when he woke up from this mystical dream, this is what he wrote down. How A got leave an ox to be, no camel quoth the Jews like G. I never explained this, by the way. I don't think it would serve any purpose. But in fact, one of the things we'll see as we go through this whole course, this whole program, is how many times and in how many different ways this cosmology, the cosmology that was presented to me, that I offered to you, has already been seen, felt, recognized, and just masked. You see, the moment that the crystal shattered, that the one, the truth of the one, and of course in our case the truth of the two, the truth of the binary, forever lost. I mean, forever lost within the context of, how all of this is intended to work. I mean, one of the most interesting things about the time to come, and I mean beyond this round, into the next phase of the incarnation, is the fact that the entire effort will be to try to reform that extraordinary crystal. But to reform that extraordinary crystal after billions of years of experience. How amazing this process. This prana. It's really a prana. You have that crystal and it shatters open in this enormous breath. And then slowly, over time, gaining all that experience and finally getting to a point where it all reassembles. Now, God leave an ox to be. Ah, such a story. I love the story of the ox. It is the ban that brings the rave to their knees. It is the ignorant rave's God. Consciousness, awareness, love, direction, the forms out of which it can all be experienced. This is out of the ban, and the ban is not yang, it is yin. We all need to know why. Self-reflected consciousness is like that. The moment that you come into this incarnation, the very first thing that is there deep, deep within is why. What is this all about? And it is the passenger in the illusion that is left to ponder this. And the passenger ponders with a ban aspect, what we call the personality crystal. And the very gods that humans endowed with these crystals, imagine, they're just fellow crystals, but they're someplace else. There's the crystal that's at the heart of Mars, and there's the crystal that is in Alcyone of the Pleiades, and there are the extraordinary crystals that are in our sun. And you see, it is this ban, it is this potential to interface with the neutrino program that gives us all of these thoughts, that brings us to this wonder about the nature of the consciousness field. I'm not in awe of all of that. It's so interesting to be at a point in my process where I realize that this illusion, the construct that we all live in, this Maya, it is a temporary distraction on a very long road. It's not about what made us, because we are not an us. We are beings trapped in the illusion of our separateness by monopoles that want to go back to their design crystals. That this is a necessary step in the experimentation, in the evolutionary sense, of whether or not form can be endowed with a unique consciousness. Is it possible? Can it work? And what we're learning in this process is not a learning that you and I think it's all about. The learning is going on at a design level, and at a level we have no understanding of. Truly not. It's like these bioforms. They are really inefficient. They are really inefficient. I do appreciate them. It's the only show in town. It's the only ride I have. So in that sense, I give it the respect and love it's due. But it's clear to me, just the fact that we need to feed ourselves, that takes up a lot of time and energy. An enormous amount. There's all kinds of things that are rather inefficient about the form itself. We're going through an enormous evolutionary process. But the process, the time frame that we're in now, the phase that we're in now, this is, if I could relate it to the fetus, this is a stage in development before the neocortex is something that begins to get built. This is the beginning of seeing how can the form handle consciousness best. And of course, it's not like there's anybody in a planning room, that's checking it out and testing. This is just the way the pattern evolves. But it's a form process. Deep form process. Everything is yin, except the light. And the light is an illusion. I do like that. It's so true. It tells you so much about duality. It tells you so much about the difference between relativity and juxtaposition. Yes, there is light. God bless it. How sweet. We can all see the Maya. But everything is yin. The two builds the body, the band builds the brain, the rave builds the temple. The ark is empty. We have not reached the place yet. The mystery of the ark. You see, here in this context, the ark is what, in my language, if we were talking biology, I would be talking about the neocortex. This is the holy instrument. It's a holy instrument. See, we think about the dilemmas of trying to bring artificial intelligence to machines without realizing that we have an evolved consciousness that has its direct roots in the inanimate. Not so different. Not so different at all. It's quite something to think about. And the ark? See, we don't know what we are. That's why we're looking for gods and reasons. We don't. How can we? It's not our job to know who we are. It's our job to build a vehicle that can wonder who it is. Ah, that's quite different. And who or what is going to do the wondering? Well, the wondering has yet to come because it is yet to enter into the biverse. The personality, quote unquote, of the totality hasn't arrived yet. Like a fetus, without its personality, it is not human. Not only is it not human, despite its sensory capacities and its organic development, its consciousness still can't figure out what it is or where it is. Doesn't know. Either do we. And we can't. And what is so clear for me is that we won't, because we have not reached the place yet. The whole thing to understand about this language we call evolution, it's movement in space. I mean, it's all movement. And there are things that are ahead, and that we will get there. And that because you have always been in the picture, your crystals have always been in the picture, you will be in the picture then. You will participate. Your crystals of consciousness, will participate when you get to that place. And then the ark won't be empty. Something to look forward to. This is perhaps one of the strangest of the plates. Well, for me anyway. They're all strange. What to do? For more than 2 billion years, we have difficulty right away in grasping how much time that is. I mean, that's really extraordinary how much time that is. For more than 2 billion years, the monopole and the design crystal remained one, long time moving in space, following the string, much slower than the string, which is slower than the light. Let me tell you about stars. In 1985, I disappeared in 1983, and I went through a period of about a year in my life where I went through a period of deconstruction, and basically began to live wild. And in 1985, I really began a whole series of very strange, mystical things that kept happening to me, things that I was unaware of before. I never had that relationship. And one of them was an experience that I had with a star in the sky. And it was one of the oddest things. It seemed like a whole stream of information came into me from that experience, but it was hard to judge because I was on a drug, and when you're on a drug, these are not things that you can trust as experience. But stars, stars are really incredible, because you see, we would not have a consciousness field without them. Every single star in the sky is a source of neutrinos. And all of the stars in the sky together, and of course that is a number that is unbelievable to grasp, that all of them are producing neutrinos. I mean, all of them. So the stars themselves are the source of consciousness. And in 1985, I had a very strange experience. I suddenly felt compelled to go to Jerusalem, a place I had never been. And it's an odd story. I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but one of the things that was really fascinating for me was that I spent about a month in the National Library, in the reader's room, reading about Arabic star lore. Different cultures have given us different things. You look at the Hindu Brahmin chakra system, and the channels and the Sephiroth of the Kabbalah, and Babylonian astrology, and so forth and so on. And clearly, when you look at Arabic lore, nobody had more interest in the stars than they did. As a matter of fact, almost 70% of the stars in the sky, their names are derived from Aramaic or Arabic. Aldebaran, and all of these stars. And there was a whole collection of sensitives over centuries that passed on information, generation, the way shaman will, about the nature of specific stars. It's always been there in our consciousness that there is something extraordinary about the stars. From our understanding just simply of the neutrino and what it really means, that we have a consciousness ocean, that we are programmed by the neutrino stream, that we are imprinted by the neutrino stream. I mean, everything is neutrino-based. It's easy to be a sun worshipper when you get 70% of your neutrinos from the sun. I mean, it's the source of our consciousness. It is, in many ways, our consciousness as we move it through this endlessly shattered mirror. Taking this primary input of the consciousness field from the sun. And so the knowledge of the stars, for example, if you look in the Old Testament, if you look in the New Testament, if you look in the Bhagavad Gita, if you look in the Quran, if you go to Confucian writings, you will see that the Pleiades, the so-called Seven Sisters, the Great Bear, or in German the Wagen, the Seven Brothers, the Seven Rishis, stars like Sirius, these stars, they're in all of those books. They're part of a recognized input field going way back. Nobody knew why. I mean, it's not like they could understand either the physics or the mechanics of it. But yet, it was clear. And one of the things that I learned in my mystical experience with that star was that if there is an alignment for you, and it is, your capacity, that the fractal line to any star can be extraordinary. It's a neutrino feed. It's a neutrino feed, and it's feeding you consciousness. And I began to really grasp after that, and after reading endless descriptions of the quality of certain stars, and the descriptions are very much like primitive Babylonian descriptions of the way in which the planets influence us. And of course the planets influence us because they are processing a neutrino feed through their prime crystal. So the consciousness is there in the stars. Now let me tell you about the stars. Some are older than the beginning. Now that's quite something to say. I remember what it was like for me in the very early years, before 1996, to talk about the fact that neutrinos had mass. And of course they didn't. I mean, at least at that time there was no verification, and most scientific thought was not looking in that direction. And it was a very odd feeling to say, well, neutrinos have mass, and if they have mass, of course it changes the cosmology of physics entirely. They're still trying to deal with it. They don't quite know what to do with it, as a matter of fact. But some are older than the beginning. There was an odd piece came out, I think it was about 2 years ago, and it was a star, and I think it was a star that was spectrographically analyzed, that seemed to be older than the galaxy. And of course, immediately, scientists got very upset and said that wasn't possible. There has to be something wrong with the calculation, this and that, blah, blah, blah. And then, funny enough, within about 4 or 5 months, every time you read about the age of the universe, suddenly it had gotten older, which I thought was a funny kind of consequence to discovering something that would make people very uncomfortable. It is a knowing of mine, because it is fundamental to the way in which the totality operates, that there are stars that were there before the beginning. The two and the band did not meet in a vacuum. They met on the inside, and the inside was already there. These are the stars of the wall. Now that's an interesting name. It's like a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You know, when you go out and you finally get to the edge of the universe, and you finally get to the place of the gods, and there's this wonderful sign that says "Sorry for the inconvenience." The wall, the stars of the wall. There are scientific, graphic illustrations of floating neutrino walls in outer space. I mean, floating, traveling through space. And I'm not talking about little walls. I'm talking about walls that are light years in length. And again, a light year in length would mean traveling at 186,000 miles a second for a full year, so you're going to travel very, very far. And extraordinarily thick, or wide, if you will. And there are these densities, if you will, of neutrinos. See, I don't have any problem recognizing that the totality is actually a form, and that the darkness that we see is simply the way our illusion works. In other words, that this is a body, and it is obvious to me that there is a body. I mentioned earlier about the Navajo, and this awareness of the umbilical cord. This connection between the child and the not self, the ring past not realm. There is a connection. I mean, umbilical cord is an odd word to use because there's no way that we can really understand it in that way, but there is a connection between the biverse and what the biverse is a part of on the outside, whatever that outside happens to be. And there are stars that control that entry point, or that barrier point, or, you know, if you want to see it in the context of mother and child, which is again a very, 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 very loose metaphor, so let's be careful with it, then basically what you're looking at is the mechanism that allows the child to be nourished by the mother, but at some point it is also the place where the rejection of the mother takes place. In other words, there is an on and off in this. So here, these are the stars of the wall. One day, far away, when they begin to die, they will be the enemy. Until then, they are the child's greatest allies. Remember that we are on a line of neutrino string that is older than everything. It was there before the beginning. It was creating the matrix in which the light could open up the darkness. In other words, it was darkness, but it wasn't a void, and it wasn't a vacuum. It was just waiting, in that sense, to be filled with light and form as a principle. So the stars, there are some that are older than the beginning, and like all of the various aspects of the knowledge that touch on various areas of science, whether it's the physics of things or the biology or the genetics, that I am clear that time will, bring the evidence and bring the firm evidence that, in fact, there are stars that are older in the galaxy. And wouldn't that just shatter? I mean, the physics community is already in an enormous turmoil. The neutrino has created enormous difficulties. How do you account for all of that mass? I mean, there are now all kinds of physicists who are claiming that the neutrino carries consciousness. As my son would say, duh, yes, good, I mean, it is changing the way in which we have to think about the whole. But to really grasp that when it's proven, and hopefully some of you as witnesses are alive for that when it's proven, then it's clear, something deeply, deeply mystical, that we are in fact one living, evolving entity. And that not only are we one living, evolving entity, but at some point it's going to be born, whatever that means. At some point there is going to be an extraordinary metamorphosis. The phases of cosmic evolution from the Rave scale are initiated in violent events. And it's one of the things that you get to see in the nature of all life and in the nature of all being, that the very process of existence is violent. There's an enormous violence that takes place at every level of life. There are constantly things banging into each other. There are constantly things devouring each other, both inanimate, devouring black holes, devouring stars, or inside of your body, your T cells devouring, invaders to your immune system. It's constantly going on. And it is one of the laws of the way in which cosmic evolution works. And it is clear that, every prophet that has ever predicted doom, that every voice that points towards an end, that Holy Spirit, Scripture from all kinds of faith and sects, point to this cataclysmic end somewhere out there. And oh yes, so true it is. The ending of our round is not something where the clock goes off and suddenly life stops existing on the planet. No, it will be initiated in a violent event. It's the way things work. There are thousands of asteroids in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. There are thousands of them that will have in their orbital lifetime the possibility of close encounters with this planet. We had such an event 65 million years ago, and we have absolute evidence. This is more than likely what ended the reign of reptilians in the world and gave rise to our mammalian future. And this was an object striking the Gulf of Mexico, and of course we have found iridium deposits all over the planet from the same event. So there was what they call nuclear winter. That is, there was so much debris thrown up into the sky that the Earth became incredibly cold for many years. And this is basically what destroyed the reptiles. But this was just a rock, and not a huge, big one. Just one big enough to, change the equation. And there's an asteroid out there, or a comet in the Kuiper belt that comes roaring around the sun every once in a while. One of them has our number on it. It just will. It's the way things work. It's the way it has always worked. So the bundle, billions of years, guided by the monopole, one with the design, in movement towards the possibility of expressing love, eventually reached its initiating place, meeting the star of the wall. And of course, basically what you're looking at, and you can sort of see it in this illustration, is that when it bangs into this star, this really is what initiates the whole life process. This is what initiates the shattering and the disembedding of the prime magnetic monopole from the prime design crystal. This is the beginning of the true form principle, not cellular, that's already out there and expanding along the lines of string that have emerged, but here you have the beginning of the programming agency, the capacity through this fractalized crystal and the monopoles to begin this process of controlling and programming, in that sense, the ultimate capacity of form to be endowed with consciousness. Remember, that is the only goal, to endow form with consciousness. This is what it's all about. Love went away that day. The monopole and the design crystal are truly one. And the moment that they separate is the moment that we become an act of love. And of course that's a very spiritual way of seeing it, but it's very beautiful to understand that we as life are the breath of love. We are not love. We cannot possess it, but we are the very byproduct of it. This separation of design and monopole, we become the expression of love in that sense. And that is the initiation of being. In other words, this is the beginning of the process of organized consciousness. When they meet again, it is death, darker than the night of Brahma, for it is death to the child. And you see, when they meet again, voice never told me how long this thing will exist. It only told me how long it would take to get to the point that it could emerge into the world that is beyond its own, whatever that means. Whatever that means. One can assume that maybe it will exist for tens of billions of years. Who knows? But at some point, it too shall die. And it's something that is interesting about the whole nature of the program. There is always death. Doesn't matter about scale. There is always death. And there is always rebirth. It's an endless program. It is one of my deepest goals, and I've begun that process, and it got stuck, and eventually it is a place I will return to, is to be able to find a way to prove incarnation. This is the story of everything. It's the story of everything. And it is the magic of the monopole and the design crystal. It is their magic. They are older than the Biverse. We're talking about something that is so ancient that we can't imagine how long that line is. This is what it's all about. This is the very prana of life. It is the very prana of existence. It's what it's all about. Monopole and design crystal. It's why in the end, the joy that comes to anyone who meets human design is that they can align their form to what is correct, regardless of how the passenger takes it. And that in and of itself brings relief and comfort. It's the form. It's all about the form. And the whole thing about the form is that it is only held together for so long. Every form has its span. And every span is subject to scale. It's subject to scale. It's like that line of ants, very busy going across your sidewalk to get to the nearest garbage can. And it's a sunny day, and you walk over them. You just step over them. And you don't stop. You're just walking. But as you step over them, you cast a shadow. For them, that's 2 weeks without light. It's just about scale. It's always about scale. But there is always a beginning, and there is always an end. And in that, there is something very satisfying, because it is the way. See, immortality is an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing from the point of view that there is a deep recognition within us that there are lifespans that exist that are extraordinary. The lifespan of the stars that we see, the lifespan of our planet. The Earth is an old object. It's a very old object. Our life is half a breath of the Earth's age. It's old. And yet, within its relative relationship to the other planets, if it were conscious, self-reflected conscious, and it's not. It is just a programming agency. But if it were, it would all be relative, after all. And that, for me, is something that's really, I find it very satisfying.